Welcome friends to the next session on arms race. Here we will start with discussing the 20th century arms race, how it happened in the 20th century. The Cold War nuclear arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States of America is a good example of a 20th century arms race. The United States' use of nuclear weapons at the end of the World War II actually made the Soviets to go in the pursuit of nuclear weapons because they realized that in this world, which is unfolding before us, unless they possess nuclear weapons, they would not be able to have claims to be a superpower in the world. And eventually, when they got that nuclear weapon, it was followed by a long-running nuclear arms race between these two superpowers. The Soviet Union conducted its first nuclear test in the year 1949, and by the end of the year 1956, the United States had more than 2,000 strategic warheads, and the Soviet Union at that time had only 84. But the Soviets, went on to increase their numbers very fast in the subsequent decades. And Americans also added to that, and one could just, by looking at the arsenals, one could understand, how dangerous those arsenals were because they had the capacity to extinguish the whole humankind many times over. So by the year 1967, the Americans had almost 31,000 nuclear warheads, and the Soviet Union 20 years later had around 40,000. So the end of the Cold War by the 1990s, appeared actually to have ended the arms race, actually the nuclear arms race mainly. But what happened that some kind of arms race, as we discussed in the previous section, continued. And both these countries, continued in competing with each other in terms of acquiring weapons, although that kind of intensity which was there in the Cold War years and the kind of nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads, competition which was going on between the two countries, did not rather continue after the end of the Cold War. But the competition or some kind of an inert kind of competition continued. Arms race basically may involve sometimes a more general competitive acquisition of military capability. And that military capability is sometimes measured by the kind of expenditure which a particular country incurs to bolster its military strength. Although there is no direct linkage, between military expenditure and the military capability of a country. Sometimes the capability could be weak and the expenditure could be high. Sometimes these general arm races are often observed among countries or between countries who have some kind of historical rivalries, and therefore they tend to be following each other's military spending levels. And when the tension is heightened, then these countries compete more in terms of spending on their weaponry. And that happens always, when we look at the arms race between India and Pakistan. But once there is a situation of conflict, or when wars have happened in the past, or when there has been a situation of increased tension, there has been an intensity in the military spending of these countries. And of course, the acquisition of more and more weapons. Now, what we need to look at the consequences of these arms races. What happens actually? Usually, what we understand that arms races would always have negative consequences in both economic and security terms, because large-scale acquisitions of weapons need huge economic resources. And if two countries, or maybe more than two countries, spend large sums of money just to neutralize each other's efforts in that direction, the expenditure these two countries are incurring would seem to be a wastage of money. However, there is a considerable debate surrounding the economic effects of military spending. Some scholars argue that it provides benefits through technological spin offs, job creation, and even infrastructural development. Others would argue that it displaces more productive forms of investment, while its final output is not itself productive. So the money which a country is spending, say in weapons, that could have been spent in more productive forms of investment. But the country would not do that because it is involved in some kind of an arms race with an adversary. So large sums of money, are going to be spent on weapons. For example, India and Pakistan are classic examples of this. That both of them are relatively poorer countries, although India is much more economically strong as compared to Pakistan, but they can ill afford to spend that amount of money which they every year earmark for the military spending. Certainly, countries that imports arms on larger scales would see some negative economic consequences of the arms race. And the arms imports would often be a major contributor to debt, to the increasing debt in these developing countries. Again, a classic example is Pakistan, which has spent so much of money on its weapons when it does not have enough resources to even feed its population. So it's not even able to service its debt. The interest which comes on the debt which it takes from international financial institutions is not even able to repay that. And then it is making huge expenses on its weaponry. So what happens that it is a major contributor, to the economic miseries of countries like Pakistan or many African countries or even Latin American countries and many other, relatively poorer countries in the world. Even for the arms producing countries, excessive military expenditure is likely to eventually have negative economic consequences. A lot of people argue that the basic reason for Soviet Union's collapse or its economic difficulties was certainly exacerbated by the very high proportion of their GDP which was devoted to the arms race. So on the one hand, the Soviet economy was going down. There were many reasons for that. Because of the kind of agricultural system, centrally controlled agricultural system which they were having, their economy was closed. And they had rather other difficulties because of which the economy was floundering, but they were not able to reduce the expenditure on the weapons, which they were doing. And consequently, what happened that precipitated the collapse of the Soviet Union to a significant extent. The other question, whether arms races contribute to war, is also a subject of considerable debate. Because an arms race may heighten fear and hostility on the part of countries involved. But whether this contributes actually to war is hard to measure. Some empirical studies have been done which do find that arms races are in some way associated with an increased likelihood of war. However, it is not possible to say with certainty whether arms race is itself a cause of war or merely a symptom which eventually lead to exacerbation of tension between and among countries of the world. One may also consider the gains for a country that actually wins an arms race in the sense of gaining a decisive military advantage. Arguably, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which left the United States as the sole superpower in the world, was partly due to the cost of attempting to keep to the Soviet Union. So one could also argue that this was the gain which America got. Some scholars have argued that this was actually a trap which America laid, because America knew that being the richest country in the world, that Soviet Union can ill afford to continue in this arms race. So therefore they continued the arms race to ensure that the Soviet Union's collapse, which might have happened maybe a few years later, happens as early as possible, because the Soviet Union would not be able to manage itself economically while it was spending so much of money on this endless arms race. So that is again an argument which is given in this context. The other important thing to understand in this case is the international arms transfers, because that is also an important factor which is studied to understand that what are the hottest spots in the world, what are the regions in the world which are most likely to go to war. There is an important institute in Sweden located in its capital which is known as the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. This institute is a very prestigious institute and globally respected, and it conducts research on arms transfer to and from particular regions, sub-regions, states, or even non-state actors. It is aimed at both increasing the fundamental understanding of the impact of arms transfers and to support policymakers and people who are involved in the implementation of policies. An important aim and objective of CIPRI's research is to contribute to attain greater transparency as a means of ensuring responsible international arms transfers. And the purpose is thereby to prevent violent conflict or alleviate tensions and even warn about potentially destabilizing arms accumulation, and also to counter the misallocation of limited resources. So that the world can get a fair idea as to how these weapons are being transferred, which regions of the world are acquiring more weapons, which are not acquiring that number of weapons, and which are the regions where in the world, where these weapons are getting concentrated more and more. So there should be some kind of a transparency to understand, how these weapons are being transferred in the world. It also investigates international arms transfers in relation to international security and national foreign and defense policies, even interstate relations, and it tries to look at a state's compliance with international commitments such as arms embargoes or the Arms Trade Treaty or even national legislation, and it assesses arms procurement against declared defense and security policies. Some countries might declare that our country is very peaceful and we do not want to attack any country, but on the other hand, you'd find that they are accumulating a lot of weapons. So that is something, which is highlighted by the researchers of CIPRI, that this is an area of concern where the country is apparently, very peaceful and it has got very peaceful postures, but its actions are slightly different and it is on a spree to accumulate more and more weapons. So the arms transfer database, which CIPRI creates is something, which is freely accessible online, and anybody, anywhere in the world, research organizations, governments, everybody can access that, even individuals. And the basic aim is to provide valid, very reliable and consistent data about the volume and types of weapons transferred internationally. And it is something which is going on since the year 1950. And of course, the consequence is that we can get to understand the trends and patterns in international arms transfers at the international level and in certain regions of the world, which are very prone to conflicts and weapon accumulations. And even between countries, when two countries which are adversaries and geographically located cheek by jowl are doing such kind of a things. So that is something, which is highlighted and flagged by the reports. And of course, the relationship between the importers and exporters of weapons. So the database, which CIPRI creates is actually helpful in addressing a range of questions. Some of them are like this, For example, it tries to flag that who are the suppliers and the recipients of major conventional weapons transferred, what kind of weapons are being exported or imported by some countries, of the world, what is the relationship between the suppliers and the recipients, has the relationship undergone some kind of a change over time, and if two countries are in conflict in some part of the world, from where are they getting their weapon supplies, and how are the countries, which are saying that we are limiting the supply of certain dangerous weapons, How are they putting in export control regulations and regimes in their respective countries, how well they are enforcing them to actually live by their word. And then what are the potentially destabilizing build-up of weapons, where they are occurring, in which countries and which regions. And of course, to get a broad idea as to what are the consequences of all these things, which are happening in the world. They also try to help us understand the relationship between access to these weapons transfers and how these countries, which are the bigger suppliers of weapons in the world, how they are actually dealing with countries, where they actually intend that these weapons should reach. We are saying this because, there are a lot of weapons which actually are not in the hands of countries where they were actually supplied. For example, more than 80% of the light combat weapons, like the very famous AK-47 rifles, are not in the hands of state actors. Obviously, in the first place, these rifles, assault rifles, which are so very dangerous, would have been ordered by some countries, supplied by the countries who make these weapons, and they would have been sent to their armies or to their paramilitary forces or wherever they wanted to send them. But today, the situation is that 80% of all those assault rifles which were supplied by suppliers to certain specific recipients, mostly state actors, are not in their possession, and they are in the possession of non-state actors. So wherever you hear of any kind of a conflict in the world, some kind of a civil war, some kind of a guerrilla warfare, some kind of a intra-state warfare, especially happen within countries or at the borders of some countries between two non-state actors and groups, even terrorist groups, drug syndicates. In all those conflicts, usually it is these kind of light weapons, assault rifles, which are used. So what is happening, that a lot of violence which is happening in the world, not only through, it is less through formal wars between and among countries. It is more because of these kinds of weapons which have fallen in the hands of non-state actors. So it is very important to understand, how these weapons supplies flow, And if they are starting from one country, they should reach to the other country which is actually ordering those weapons, and it should be a very open transaction. And it should stay with them. That particular country should not be a conduit through which it passes to some non-state actors, terrorist groups, drug syndicates, and whatnot. So that is something, which creates a lot of instability in the international system, because at least state actors have some kind of an accountability, although many of them do not in the present world, but still. But these non-state actors are rogue actors. They are basically non-legitimate non-state actors. They are basically those actors which are given to defying all kinds of laws. They are against all kinds of legal systems. They are fighting all kinds of systems, whether they own governments or any kind of international governance structures. So they are very dangerous actors, and once these dangerous weapons fall in their hands, it becomes even more dangerous for the people of the world. And you can just imagine that if they were having, or they could in due course get access to some more dangerous kinds of weapons, especially biological and chemical weapons, which are very easy to have, then that would create a much more dangerous situation in the world. So therefore, one needs to understand that arms race is something which is very dangerous in the world, but because of the nature of the international system, where there is so much of distrust, so much of animosity among countries, so much of competition, you have to fend for yourself in the international system. All states have to survive on their own. So that is the reason why countries go on to acquire weapons, because the assumption is that weapons would give you security. But the problem is that the more weapons you acquire, the more insecurity is created. So the more powerful a country is, the bigger a country is, the richer a country is, it has more stakes of losing things. And therefore, its fears increase. And as your fear increases, you go on to acquire more and more weapons. And the more weapons you acquire, ironically, you feel more insecure. So you need more weapons. And then you need more weapons. So at a point of time, you are not competing actually with anyone, but you are competing with your own self. And the classic example in today's world is the United States of America. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, US emerged as the sole superpower. Although some kind of a competition was going on between America and the Soviet Union, but it was not that kind of a arms race which was happening, between both of them in the Cold War years. So now US was the leader. But it was not that after that, US decided to cut down its defense expenditure, cut down the amount of money which it was putting in on researches on weapons, cut down on its weaponry, but it continued to spend the same amount of money, even more, on researches in the field of weapons and acquisition of more weapons and in research and development of developing much more dangerous weapons, because its fears also went on increasing. So the fears were that maybe tomorrow somebody catches up with us. So therefore we have to continue to run and move forward because the fears are moving along with us. So interestingly, for some time you are moving in that arms race with the other actor who is your competitor. But in this arms race, once the competitor withdrew, America was running with another competitor, that is its fears. And fears, are generally less real and more imaginary. So you are competing with your fears, and you can never compete finally with your fear, because as you keep on increasing your weapons, as you keep on moving forward, the fear is always one step ahead than you. You can't beat that fear. And that has basically happened with America from 1991 till date, that it is continuing in this arms race to acquire more and more weapons, and it is never satisfied. It never feels safe, because there are some kind of imaginary fears which are always creating some kinds of doubt in the minds of American policy makers. And the military industrial complex of America is constantly involved in creating and making and configuring new and better and more dangerous kind of weapons, which you get to read sometimes. Most of the times you don't even know what they are doing, but many a time you get a glimpse of what is happening in America by some kind of a stray information which comes in through different sources before the people of the world. So that is how, arms race is something so very dangerous, and that is why we need to understand, what is arms race, how the arms race went on in the Cold War years and even before that, and what are the consequences of arms race, and how it affects the economic condition of different countries who are involved in the arms race, and how it has implications for security of countries and the world in general when they are involved in some kind of an arms race. Thank you.